Hi, my name is Winston Linquister, and I'm a current undergraduate at Duke University. So, to those who may be wondering, the purpose of this podcast is to both fight stigma surrounding mental disability, as well as give a face or voice to those involved in disability studies, a field of study that is quite often unnoticed or unknown to many. Now, mind you, I don't have any real experience with video or audio editing, and this entire podcast is basically amateur. However, I hope either way, these conversations can give to our audience a better understanding of disability studies and those involved in it. So, thanks. I hope you enjoy and have a great Disability Pride Week.
All right, so hello everybody, and welcome to the very first episode of the Mad Studies podcast for Disability Pride Week. I'm your host, Winston Linquister, and today our guest is Taylor Beck, a science journalist and former neuroscience researcher who is diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Now, Taylor has published 68 stories for 19 publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Nautilus Magazine. His work is on topics ranging from neuroscience to technology to Japan, with a little bit of Neil deGrasse Tyson sprinkled in there. So let's get started. How's it going today, Taylor?
Terrific.
Terrific. All right, so as we discussed with the podcast, you have quite a pedigree to your work. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself to the audience for what you may, to an audience that may or may not be familiar with your work?
Sure. I mean, I guess the briefest version is I've wanted to write since I was a little kid. It was later when I was about a teenager in high school that I got interested in the brain and psychology. People often ask, why would you change? Why did you change from being a literature person, an arts person, to doing science? And I always say there really wasn't a difference. There isn't a difference. That what interested me in literature was modernism, really. It was novels that were about the mind, often about madness, I suppose, actually, in retrospect. And so studying psychology and neuroscience was just, another way of approaching the study of the human mind, behavior, etc. So I studied neuroscience when I was at Princeton, primarily memory, autobiographical memory, really, which again was sort of contiguous with the sort of literary stuff. I guess that's I guess the briefest bio would be that I planned to do neuroscience research to earn a PhD and become a professor, and then write for the public from there. But at some point I realized I didn't necessarily need a doctorate to write, and that writing, after all, was what I'd always wanted to do. In the meantime, I lost my marbles somewhere in there and spent a couple years pretty topsy-turvy mood-wise. Was hospitalized, eventually found my way to the bipolar diagnosis and to lithium, which, thank God has worked very well for me. So I've been 5 years now out of the hospital, 5 years taking lithium, and 5 years, knock wood, healthy, without any further major episodes.
Interesting. So you'd say that your involvement in neuroscience wasn't stemmed from your diagnosis of being bipolar, or did that actually increase your interest in it?
No, not at all. I wasn't diagnosed. I hadn't had the slightest sort of mental health problem at the time when I got interested in neuroscience. And as a matter of fact, none of my research back then had anything to do with mental illness. It was much more to do with basic brain function. I wanted to know how do each of us create the world differently? As you and I are having this conversation now, I'm speaking these words, you're speaking your words, we're hearing essentially the same words, but we'll recall a different experience later. And I was interested in, how does that happen? What does your brain do to record this experience in a way different than mine? So it was, I suppose it was related in the sense that individual difference, as I see it, is sort of at the heart of the study of mental illness as well. But back then, I didn't really study mental health. I wasn't planning to become a doctor or a therapist or anything. I just wanted to be a researcher studying the brain. It was really more of a coincidence, I guess.
Nice. So how has studying neuroscience kind of helped you to understand your own disorder in terms of just how you've come to accept it, or maybe how you've come to deal with it with day-to-day life?
That's a good question. I would say the funniest thing about it was that as soon as anything started happening to me, now I don't know if the audience is familiar really with what mania looks like, which is essentially what bipolar is. I think there's a misunderstanding often with bipolar that it has more to do with mood. People tend to think of it in the same category as depression and as a so-called mood disorder, but it's really more a matter of energy. It looks like it has to do with mood because both the sort of euphoric highs and the agitated kind of nervous, angsty, talkative states that people can go into when they're manic, they have a mood component to them, and certainly the crash that you go into that can last 6 months on the heels of a really intense mania, it looks like depression. It looks the same. It looks very similar to unipolar depression. But we know, for example, that lithium doesn't work as an antidepressant. It doesn't actually have an effect on depression. So if bipolar were really, as its modern name suggests, a condition of two poles, this drug shouldn't actually be effective at treating it. The reason it is that the fundamental core of the thing is manic. It's mania. And because lithium is effective in something like a third of cases at controlling the manias, it prevents both ends of the spectrum. So I give you this background because what I would say is that I was always a talkative person. I was always a high energy person, a sort of goal-directed person who could easily get excited about any number of things that interested me, as I think very many high-achieving young kids can that are either whether you're trying to get a job that makes you lots of money, or you're working really hard because you're fascinated by the arts and you just want to you just want to be able to create. There's a lot of people with that kind of drive and ambition. It's not really limited to people with disorders, and certainly when I was that way as an adolescent and a teenager, nobody saw it as abnormal. But when I was about 25 years old, working in a neuroscience lab in Kyoto, Japan, studying sleep, as a matter of fact. It was another strange coincidental irony because I was studying sleep and dreaming at the time when I really quit sleeping myself. Listeners may not realize the most obvious sort of physiological correlate of mania is that people really don't need sleep. You sleep, 2, 3, 4 hours a night, and wake up feeling this excited urge, in my case, to write, usually to write and write and write. I was writing down all my dreams. And I was, because we were studying dreams. So what I mean to say is that because I had this sort of background in science and neuroscience, from the very beginning, I was interested in recording and observing everything that was happening in my brain, even if I didn't label it or categorize it as clinical, which of course I didn't. Like everyone, like many people, I certainly resisted that label for years. It was 3 years from that point before I was finally hospitalized and treated. So I would say it had a massive effect because the actual manifest content of my my episodes was often scientific. I would write long emails to all of my friends, and people that weren't really my friends. Another classic thing, I would email sort of everyone that I knew, professors who I hadn't seen in years, ex-girlfriends, people who weren't even my ex-girlfriend, but I talked to them like they were. And I blast them with these long kind of half personal, half intellectual rants about what I thought was going on in my brain. Certainly when I was at the hospital, I was writing and writing and writing, trying to record everything that I saw there about how the doctors conducted their business and whatnot. So it's a very long-winded answer to your question. That I'll give a very short-winded answer to how it affects my life now, which is to say that ever since leaving the hospital, pretty much after a 6-month stay that was pretty pretty down at my parents' place in Virginia, a period when I was pretty, flatlined. Once I emerged from that, I've never. There was only a very short period when I had anything but a curious attitude about the condition, rather than I don't think I felt very much of the shame or the outsiderness, or to the extent I felt an outsiderness, I was almost proud of it or excited about it. Once I get better, and that's not to say there wasn't a 3-year long period when I did anything I could to avoid getting seen that way. And now, of course, I make my living writing about neuroscience and the brain, and a lot of the stories I write have to do with mental illness. And now, of course, my interest is influenced by the fact that I'm bipolar myself.
Mm-hmm. So you basically said, or it definitely sounds like you're taking the more scientific approach to understanding your mental illness and everything involved with it. So you said for a while you wanted to avoid that label of being necessarily diagnosed as such, and that there was a period of time where, would you say you were having trouble coming to terms with it?
The way it originally showed, which I think is true for most people, was when I returned from Japan. I lived there for 3 years after college, learned Japanese, poured all my energies into learning this language, this foreign culture, and I should say, I learned Japanese from elementary schoolers. My Japanese isn't perfect, but I returned to the U.S. and suddenly all that I've spent the last 3 years doing seems useless. I mean, I don't have anyone to speak Japanese to. My friends from college have gone after degrees and graduate degrees, medical degrees, law degrees. Some are done already. And what have I been doing? I've been just sort of, it seems to me at this point, kind of coasting, exploring this foreign culture for sure. But suddenly that doesn't seem to have as much value to me, and I feel like I'm behind in life. And I think the combination of those stresses sent me into this real spiral where by the time I got home, the most really memorable thing was I couldn't read. I couldn't pay attention enough to read because I was never sleeping. I wasn't interested in anything, had no libido or appetite or anything like this. And I'd already gotten a job in St. Louis. I was supposed to move to this new city and start a job, and I did. Of course, I had to do that. But I showed up there, not myself. Of course, no one there knew what myself was. So to them, I remember that the girlfriend that I met there, the woman I met there who eventually became my girlfriend, she said she thought I was just a quiet, kind of mellow guy, which is, nothing like what I'm actually like. I'm a very talkative person, an energetic person, but I didn't seem at all like myself. And I describe all this because I think this is the way it happens for a lot of people. The thing you see first is what looks like a classic depression, and depression is something that I think we conceptualize as episodic and sort of circumstantial and fixable. Of course, maybe there are people with some sort of genetic form of recurrent endogenous depression that's a little more like bipolar, but I think culturally we tend to think about it more like something you might have because something went wrong in your life. Like say you lived in Japan for 3 years and you came back and you thought you made a mistake and you weren't sure you wanted to become a scientist after all. Maybe you wanted to be a writer. How can you become a writer? That's sort of a reason. It seemed like a circumstantial reason. And so I really did fight it. There were years where I thought it's just a circumstantial problem I've had, and if I can just get the right pill that'll take that away, and then once I get better, I won't have to take those anymore. What I resisted, that I think is scary to a lot of people, is the idea that no, in fact, you might have a chronic condition that's never going away, and you're going to be taking a drug forever. So I think the drug it was the lithium that I resisted the most sort of stridently early on, because nobody talked about it as something you'd take a little while. It was clearly something you were going to take forever, and or a long time before you switched to something else. And I didn't like that. I didn't like the idea of settling into a long-term understanding that I was different.
Mm-hmm. So you talked about conceptualizing these possible mental illnesses. How would you conceptualize bipolarism just for people who have no experience with it whatsoever, just in terms of its presence in your life?
Well, the thing that interests me the most lately is the what I would call the genetic basis of identity, or the genetic basis of personality. And I think that's a question. My sister is a pediatrician and a psychologist, as a psychology major in college, and she's very interested in Myers-Briggs personality tests. I know a lot of people are interested on dating sites. You'll see people say, "Oh, I'm an ENFP," about extroversion and these other dimensions of personality. But the truth is that social psychologists and neuroscientists both actually think seriously about the sort of dimensions of personality that are hereditary. It's kind of obvious. It's sort of intuitive that some dimensions of personality are hereditary. We see that, mothers and fathers resemble their children in certain ways. I have my mother's personality. We say I'm my father's son, or my mother's, daughter. So the way I see it, mental illnesses, particularly bipolar, which is enormously hereditary. They call it something like 80 to 95% heritable. They are. I believe that they're identities analogous to personalities like that, and that really what we're talking about is just the fundamental nature of a person being having extremes of certain traits that you've probably had since birth, and you'll have for the rest of your life. And so what there's hope for is controlling or treating or stabilizing these more extreme traits. What there's not hope for, thank God, is a cure, because what a cure would mean, as I see it, is pretty much to change a person forever, to make a person not himself anymore.
Oh, that's very interesting. So, you would you necessarily even view it as a disability then, in terms of how it affects you? Just because you said it's not necessarily the best to look for it as a cure, but more as a faction of your identity. So, yeah, any thoughts on that?
I tend to think of manic depression as comparable to autism spectrum disorders in this way, in that indeed a lot of the classic traits associated with bipolar, like the classic traits associated with autism, have some pretty conspicuous benefits. I mean, we think of the rare sort of savant type characters with Asperger's or autism, and indeed, although it must be pointed out, they are also rare among bipolar people. They are the exception to the rule. Bipolar causes a great deal of suffering, and I'm not advocating that it not be treated, but I do believe that there's a reason an overwhelmingly high proportion of poets, bebop musicians, painters, artists, novelists either have the condition or have the condition in their families, and some of the personality traits associated with mania in them. So I think it's a wrong-headed idea to think that people diagnosed with this condition who maybe take a drug are sort of categorically different from from other people who share a lot of the, similar personality traits that are often constructive. I mean, having a huge amount of energy, not needing to sleep much, being enthusiastic, being sociable, liking to connect with people, finding it easy to connect with new people. These are obviously traits that are advantageous in any number of careers, not just the artistic ones I named, but also business, any number of careers. So I hope that answers your question.
Oh yeah, you're fine. You're fine. That's perfect. So, as somebody who is diagnosed with bipolarism and who has been studying neuroscience, kind of flipping the table on it, what's your opinion on the way neuroscience kind of depicts bipolarism or any mental disorders like that, just in terms of how it's portrayed or how it's studied?
Hmm. I'd answer the question in two ways. Uh, I think um, the biological study, the genetic study of bipolar disorder is incredibly valuable, not just in that it will help us develop more targeted treatments that can actually aim at the mechanism behind mania, um, but also because the more the condition is understood as a fundamentally um, g- genetic aspect of a person's identity, the more I think the public in general will understand the condition differently and better. Um, I sort of heard you asking two questions there, so I certainly have no problem with the way the biologists and the psychologists are studying the brains of people with bipolar and the genetics. I think I should clarify the reason we need that is because only a third. Lithium is basically the most effective psychiatric drug that we have. The antidepressants, the antipsychotics, they work incredibly unreliably. Even when they work, a person on these drugs is very often pretty impaired. But if you happen to be one of the lucky 1/3 of people diagnosed with manic depression, and you take lithium, very often you live a completely normal life. Basically, a person would never predict that you have a mental illness. We want to be able to say the same for the other 2/3 of people with bipolar. We won't be able to say until we can understand what exactly is going wrong in their brains, or maybe not wrong. What exactly is acting differently in their brains, and how might we be able to modulate that? I think a separate question is, how do the experts on mental illness, the sort of social experts on mental illness, represents the condition and make the argument for acceptance? And I do think I have an ambivalent feeling about the way that the so-called mad rights movement chooses to sort of speak about these conditions and represent people with the conditions. I think the most urgent priority, it seems to me, is to not victimize and to not label people with conditions like this as other or different. I think very, very well-intentioned people who want to help the mentally ill do them a disservice by talking to them and about them in a way that's very different than they would talk to someone they didn't think was mentally ill. So I suppose I'm much more for integration than I am for sort of I don't know what the word is. I think it's better to talk informally and openly about and with humor about this stuff than it is to sort of create an official approved language for treating these delicate little flowers. I don't think most of us want to be treated like delicate little flowers. We want to be treated like humans.
Mm-hmm. So you're kind of touching on the aspect of like stigma, whether it be at an institutional level or just within the field of neuroscience itself. Have you ever experienced any stigma yourself, or whether it be personally or in a professional sense, or have you largely been scot-free in that aspect?
Things get prickly here. Things get hairy here because my quick answer is no. I think I've been very lucky. I certainly have never been discriminated against because of some diagnosis that I carry. I think it's mostly because people usually don't know it. Despite the fact that I've published about it, I'm very open. But I don't know, the average person who encounters me or meets me somewhere doesn't know it. So they don't necessarily have a reason to treat me differently. That said, the one reason someone might treat me differently would be because of behaviors of my own. As I've said, because this condition is genetic and it's wired deeply into the connections in your brain and your personality, and you've essentially had it forever, you still manifest. Sorry, let me not talk scientifically. You still talk like a high energy person. You still talk like a fairly self-involved person. You talk like a person who finds it very difficult not to gush endlessly about whatever it is that excites you at the moment. You still talk like a person who has trouble controlling your emotions and your enthusiasms. That can be charismatic, that can be winning, that can be a positive trait, but it can also be irritating. If you're in an intimate relationship, if you're dating somebody, they don't want to be preached at. They want to have a two-way conversation. They don't want you to speak in sentences like the ones I've been using with you today that don't have periods at the end, that just go on endlessly, clause after clause. And so your question is about stigma, but I have to say, I don't consider it stigma if someone responds in a critical way to antisocial behavior like that. I think that's the really delicate business about trying to build a wall around people who are so-called mentally disabled and sort of build the equivalent of ramps for people with wheelchairs. It's not as simple as ramps for people with wheelchairs here, because there's no reason the world should accommodate antisocial behavior. These are places where people like me have to learn to curb your own tendencies to get along with other people, in my opinion.
No, definitely. And you definitely have your own right to your opinion and everything like that. So what would you say is your opinion on the MAD studies and disability advocacy movement as of right now? Do you think it's taking the correct approach in terms of bringing awareness to people with mental disabilities, or do you think there are other ways they can modify their approach in spreading their message?
I have to answer the question as a science writer. Okay, so my answer to your question is, I'm so glad the MAD studies, the disability studies academic field exists, and I absolutely think it's having a positive effect. I would never speak ill of the good people who are involved with it, and as I said, I think there is a way in which sort of the careful academic study of subjects like this will trickle down into culture and society, and it's only because it's the same way with historians as it is with political scientists, as it is with economists. as with all of these other fields, I think having an academic field of disability studies or MAD studies is going bound to be influential. But as a science writer, for the general public, I also have to say the audience of any piece of writing written in the language of academia is going to be limited. And I think it's extremely necessary that there be other voices too, talking about these subjects in a more informal and a more layperson way. And as I've said before, I think humor is essential. There's a great graphic novelist named Ellen Forney who's written a terrific graphic novel called Marbles about her experience with bipolar disorder. I think it's a great example of a book that anyone might pick up off the shelf to read, not just somebody with a condition, not just somebody who has a relative with a condition. And I don't think the vast majority of books about mental illness can say that. I think the vast majority have black covers and a sad-looking person on the cover, and nobody's going to pick up that book unless they're personally affected. So I think if we're really going to change how society at large sees mental illness, we've got to find ways of presenting it to them that are not academic and that are not dark.
Definitely. And in my own studies of MAD studies and the disability pride movement, there seems to be a lot of tension between that and the established basically the establishment of psychiatry and their approach for treating mental illness with medication. How would you propose people bridge that gap, or how would you propose that either side really comes to an understanding of each other and what they're trying to achieve?
Okay, I think manic depression is the perfect condition to discuss this about because there's very little ambiguity. I understand dating back to the 60s and, R.D. Lang, I believe was his name, some of these psychiatrists and psychologists, these rebel psychiatrists and psychologists really came to believe that medication was doing more harm than good, and that mental illness was really an identity, not a disease, and you shouldn't be trying to cure it. And you've heard me say some of these similar things. However, I think manic depression is one of a few disorders, schizophrenia is another, that are very clearly linked to genetics and to known abnormalities in the brain. And they're progressive. If you don't treat them, you can see the actual degeneration of a brain, almost like you'd see with Alzheimer's or dementia. I think it's beyond wrong. I think it's unethical not to be treating somebody with bipolar disorder on the basis of some sort of mad pride argument that his special creativity is going to be ruined. I think the second sort of argument along these lines is that there's no evidence for the claim that a lot of people insist that if you treat a person's mania, their creativity suffers. The reason I say that is because from both scientific reading and everyday personal experience, I know that lithium doesn't remove the fundamentally manic nature of a person's personality. A person still thinks in an associative way, the way they always have. They still have the tendency towards this sort of flight of ideas, as they call it. They still talk quickly and aggressively. They still are driven towards social contact and sexuality and so forth. And so, I think it's a big misunderstanding that mania is like a great fount of creativity. The fact that lots of creative people have bipolar doesn't mean they created their best work when they were manic. I think it's quite the contrary. I think they didn't create any of their best work, or very little, when they were manic, because, from experience, I know your tendency to be prolific far outweighs your tendency to actually be organized and clear thinking. So I think there's a real danger to romanticizing madness, and at the same time, I think there's a happy medium to be found by treating these conditions as identities more than they are diseases to be cured, but still accepting that treatment is necessary.
Definitely. So, what would you say to people who may be listening or watching that are suffering from mental illness, or particularly bipolar disorder? Say they were having trouble coming to terms with the diagnoses. What would you say to them in terms of your own experience for just getting through those steps?
I'd say today I am 32 years old, and I feel as happy and productive as I've ever felt in my life after 5 years of taking lithium, 5 years out of getting out of the hospital where I spent, a week of my life. And the 2 years prior to that, when I was most sort of floridly mad, writing excitedly. I wrote all the application essays to go to journalism school when I was as high as can be on Mania, and they were all twice as long as they were supposed to be, and some friend had to edit them back down. I don't feel in the slightest that being treated has compromised my personality, compromised my creativity, compromised my energy. What I do feel is that I have the capacity to live a controlled life, to, being a freelance journalist is not easy. I mean, the money's not good. You've got to constantly be pitching stories to editors. You've got to constantly be conceiving work. No one gives you the work that you're going to do. You have to create it yourself. No one could do that if they were disorganized. No one could do that if they were unable to control their mood swings. And so, what I would say to somebody if they were worried about getting treated or resistant to the diagnosis is that only good comes out of it, and only suffering can come out of that kind of resistance.
Nice. So, how does your bipolarism interact with you now? You said you're on lithium. Is it really involved in your life anymore, or is it largely suppressed?
No, it's not suppressed. It's not suppressed because it's me. It's my personality. There's no escaping it. So what I mean by that is most noticeably relationships. It challenges relationships. As I said, romantic relationships in particular, because that's a person you're going to live with constantly. But even, friendships, roommates. I mean, the same kind of force in you that can make you compelling, that can make you exciting, that can make you charismatic, can also make you extremely exhausting to other people. The same energy that wears me out. I mean, I wear myself out periodically. That energy can wear other people out, and you've got to always be kind of mindful of the energy. Both for your own sake and for others. I would say for your own sake, you've got to be mindful because, as I said at the top of this conversation, it's really more about waves of energy than it is of mood. And the thing about that energy is that you'll have these days where you suddenly feel you can do everything and anything all at once. And you'll pour yourself into many projects, and you will call all those people you've been meaning to call, and you'll zip off emails to all those people you've been meaning to get back in touch with, and maybe you'll call your mom. Your mom wanted to talk to you, and you'll who knows? You'll go to the bar. You'll flirt with some new person that you didn't know before, but then the next day you'll barely be able to get anything done. And my personal experience of it is that it's seldom all that sad. It's not really about a swing between euphoria and sadness or depression. It's rather this seesaw between excitement and exhaustion. And so monitoring those kind of waves of energy, I would say is the key way it affects my life, and it'll forever affect my life that way. Now, what I would say to make that point not dark is that everyone would benefit from being mindful in this way. And I think that most people don't have to be, because their behavior doesn't actually cause them troubles they need to try to avoid. But it's quite a blessing to become so mindful of your energy and so mindful of your moods that you can intervene to try to make your life better, try to make your relationships better.
Nice. So, just in general, how do you avoid that negativity in terms of just thinking about mental disability? You said that you want it to be treated with humor and you wanted to avoid those black covers with sad-looking people. How do you basically avoid that sort of sadness or potential downsides to it, really? Or just in terms of thinking about it?
Well, I think, let me put it one way, okay? Think about this for a moment. Think about all the writers and musicians that we know of that had mental illnesses. So I'll give you some examples, maybe Ernest Hemingway, who else? The jazz musician Thelonious Monk. Charlie Parker, another bebop musician who is also bipolar. What's his name? Melville. Virginia Woolf. The interesting thing about many of these characters, David Foster Wallace, the interesting thing about them is that because they committed suicide, we have a certain way that we think about them. Not all the ones I just named committed suicide, but most did, and some died of drug overdoses that were sort of connected to their mental illness. However, the vast majority of these people in their day-to-day life, they didn't live darkly. I don't know if you've ever read much about Charlie Parker, but he lived his life the way his music sounds. He was a very ebullient, talkative, cheerful guy, constantly making jokes, constantly flirting, befriending everybody that he met. And yet we think about him in terms of heroin and the way he died young. And I think the reason I bring up these people is because I think it would be better if we didn't think of their biographies that way. And I think we only do because we have really stigmatized old-fashioned ideas about suicide and mental illness. I mean, a suicide, the moment that Ernest Hemingway put a shotgun in his mouth and pulled the trigger was one tiny moment of his life. And, I think he's one case where, because of the overwhelming wealth of other stories we have of him, his reputation did kind of survive in a different way. We do still think about him as the Papa Hemingway, the jolly, big-bearded adventurer. But I think one way is that we need to characterize people with these conditions in broader terms and not focus on the aspects of their life that are the most kind of exotic and juicy and sexy to us because they're so unusual, but that are actually just a facet, and a rather small facet, I would say. It was only a week of my life, for example, and knock wood, hopefully that's all it will ever have been. And sure, I mentioned the other bits about the sort of enduring way that the condition affects me, but I would say that by the same token, it affects me in innumerable positive ways. I attribute so many qualities of my personality to the condition, the best qualities, the ones I love the most, and the ones that I know every friend I've got and every woman who ever falls in love with me likes. I don't think we tend to write about people with these conditions in that way.
Definitely. Oh, go ahead. Oh, were you going to say something after? Or
Just emphasizing the positive, and the normal. And the funny, I mean, the thing I always find a little funny when other people write about people with, mental illnesses is that everybody I know with a mental illness is really funny. They all have a dark, hilarious sense of humor. And honestly, I think there's no sense of humor funnier than a dark sense of humor. Because what's a famous old line about the flip side of tragedy is comedy? I think anybody who suffered especially has a familiarity with that, and they know the value of jokes. And yet so much of what other people write about these people is so serious. It's so completely absent of humor. I think it's not just bad marketing for mental illness, but it's also inaccurate representation of what these people are like.
So, would you say that the writing that you do concerning neuroscience and mental disability is a means to kind of get rid of that old stigmatized writing that either romanticizes mental illness or puts it as some sort of inescapable hole that people are in? What's the purpose of your writing in terms of just spreading your own experience and your message?
Absolutely, that's what I want to do. I want to normalize. I don't just write about the mentally ill. I'm also interested in writing about the mental health in all people. I think it's not just the categorically mentally ill that are stigmatized, but darkness inside everyone. That I think we live in a culture where when someone asks you how are you doing, the answer is great, fine. And of course on one level that makes sense. I mean, there's a time and a place to have a deep, heavy conversation about whatever's bothering you, and it's not necessarily when your colleague walks down, says hello to you in the hall. But at the same time, I think we'd be living in a better world if we lived in a world where people weren't ashamed of their feelings, and people weren't ashamed of whatever kind of suffering they have, and not only if they were not ashamed, but if they were able to give expression to it in ways that were both cathartic and possibly even sort of entertaining, funny. I think when we do, even if we do it rarely, when we do open up honestly about the stories of whatever troubles us most, it tends to be entertaining in a way for both sides. And so absolutely, that's definitely my mission. And on the other side, I never quit being fascinated by how the brain works, and by genetics. And so a lot of my writing is also simply educational. I just want the general public to understand the exciting discoveries that scientists are making every day about not just mental illness, but how does memory work? How does sleep work? Why do we need sleep? Why do we dream? These kind of fundamental questions never stopped interesting me.
Nice. Basically, how would you put your identity of your mental, of your bipolarism to you, and what does it mean to you as of right now? That's the most concise way I can put it. Sorry.
No problem. To me, it's just who I am. There's no separation between a condition and myself. So honestly, I'm pretty ambivalent or indifferent as to whether people identify me with the condition or not. Of course, it makes sense to. Of course, I mean, it's like the operating system that you have on your computer or something. I obviously have it because my behavior responds so robustly to the salt, the simple salt that we know treats it. So I wouldn't have any problem with someone thinking of me that way. But I would also counter to anyone who considers someone with a condition like this other or different, that the characteristics that make up my personality, which are both positive and negative, the high energy that can be both creative and overbearing. It's no different than the character traits that any other person has, which can, on the one hand, be seen in a good light, and in the other hand, a bad one. I think the conversation we should really be having is about personality and the biology of personality, the genetics of personality. People tend to think about how you're shaped by the way you were raised or where you were born and so forth. And I don't mean to diminish the effect of environment, nurture, but I think there's a huge influence of heredity and genetics on who a person is, a person's identity. And I think discovering that and understanding it better, understanding how a person's identity is encoded in their brain, is just fascinating scientifically and useful medically for people like me.
All right, perfect. All right, thank you so much, Taylor, for your time. All right, everybody, that was Taylor Beck, and this is the first podcast for Disability Pride Week. You have a good night, Taylor.
Yeah, thank you very much.
No
Appreciate it,
problem.
Winston.
Have a good evening.